Welcome everyone to Gems from the Wisdom Traditions, a conversation circle, where each week we draw from a topic in the Still and Moving Center Almanac with the 2022 theme of Citizens of the Future. This week, we are taking up the topic of life in the body. And as citizens of the future, at least while we are alive, will be living in one of those things called body. And we're going to look at it from a deeper perspective than some times we might. This is going to be from the Theosophical perspective. Our speaker for today is Joe Miller. He has been a student of Theosophy for a number of decades. He's spoken on many occasions here and in Santa Barbara and elsewhere, actually around the world, on this topic from the Theosophical tradition. And he is, in particular, a fan of Walt Whitman. I think of Joe as both a practical and a poetical philosopher. And he has even impersonated Walt Whitman. And Walt Whitman is someone who certainly loved and appreciated life in the body in a way that really wasn't being done, I think, in his time before he did it in the way that he did. So, Joe, can I hand it over to you now?
Thank you very much, Renee. And aloha to all of you. I'm glad to have an opportunity to share a few thoughts, a little grist for the mill that will could stimulate our discussion this afternoon. What I wanted to talk about really just comes right on the heels of what happened in the meeting last week, of what was discussed, where Elizabeth came in and she gave a keyboard metaphor for life. And I felt so in tune with so many of the things that were said. But one of the things that Elizabeth emphasized was that, that the keyboard, for her, the keyboard represents the full spectrum of our being, moving all the way from the material and the more gross or physical aspect of ourselves, all the way up to the more ethereal parts in our mental life and beyond that. And as she said, only in the body can you play the whole keyboard. And I felt a lot of sympathy with that because, as Renee mentioned, I'm a great fan of Whitman's. Whitman called himself the poet of the body and the poet of the soul, and was striking a keynote in American culture. American culture in the mid-19th century was very influenced by Victorian mores and of repression and Victorian denials of the elementary facts of life, of birth, death, sex, the body, etc. So, and he was some kind of prophet, some kind of prophetic voice spoke through him on so many areas, but he felt it was essential to learn to integrate the animal aspect of ourselves if we're really to be truthful beings. And so that's why I was really struck by that note of immanence, that the full life is the life that integrates the soul life and the bodily life. And also last week, Carol Ann spoke about her experiences, her very moving experiences, and said that we are living in the now. We are living now in the destination we seek. An insight which she brought back from a near-death experience. The destination, it's not somewhere else. We shouldn't be living for some heaven in the sky. We have to come to grips with the extraordinary power of this imminent moment, just as it is in all its fullness. And as she said, suddenly incarnate existence took on a new meaning for her, which meant to feel and sense what love feels like. So love, the abstract principle, becomes embodied through our senses and through all the lessons that embodied life represents. And then I was moved, and then Roger was speaking and drawing upon what Elizabeth had talked about, speaking about that the body is that state where we can do things. It's the state where we can have effects on one another. There's a certain brilliance to that. As he said, as the Tibetans say, only in the physical can we have an impact. So that's, I felt very much like the groundwork and the most really kind of the heart of what I've gathered from the Theosophical tradition is sort of spoken of there. And just to remind you a little bit about, what it's interesting in our Western culture, what we have inherited and the different attitudes we have towards our being, towards our spiritual being, towards our physical being. It's gone through a lot of permutations, and it's taken a lot to reach a point where we have a lot of people in tune with this integrative view. In India, there's a mythological point that's taken where it says that they say that spirit or purusha is lame, and matter, prakriti, is blind. And so it's only in the union of the two, purusha riding on the shoulders of matter, which has feet and legs, purusha, which has vision and cognition. It's only the two together that bring together this integrated being, not only our personal being, but all of existence, all of the bodies of galaxies, the bodies of planets, the bodies of plants, the bodies of trees. However, we inherit odd attitudes about embodied life through the various traditions we've been through. In ancient Gnostic views, there was a lot of skepticism about life in the body. We viewed as spiritual beings, the body and life incarnate was viewed as a kind of prison. It was the result of a fall of the spirit into generation, into matter, and represented kind of prison or probation, which then the spirit had to work its way out. And that tradition we also find echoed in Plato's dialogues, and Plato speaking about the soul being attracted to the allurement of life in a form, losing its wings, falling, and then in a state of ignorance, finding nowhere to find consolation or knowledge or wisdom in the world, begins to look into philosophy. And as the soul does so, like a teething baby, the wings of the philosopher begin to itch and sprout forth, and the philosopher is able then to reassume his lost estate. So there are these various notions that the fall, which is also represented in Genesis, a fall into incarnation, it's viewed sometimes as a kind of punishment in these different mythologies. And don't forget, the Theosophist is mostly a student of these different theologies, trying to find a synthesized wisdom that goes through it. But it's fascinating how many of them speak about our presence here as spiritual beings can be looked at as the result of some kind of fall, some kind of ignorance, or some kind of allurement that then puts us in a state, what from one standpoint is bondage, but from another standpoint represents the very gymnasium, the very exercise we need to develop those virtues, to develop that insight and that wakefulness by which we can emerge. So it isn't one or the other, it seems to be one and the same. And in Plato's dialogue, the Phaedo, which dramatizes Socrates' last meeting with his friends and also dramatizes him drinking the hemlock. Socrates, you might remember, was condemned by Athens, by the state, to death. It was, it's generally viewed that he was just a threat to the authorities because he was a fearless questioner. So he ticked off a lot of people. And he was popular with the youth, which made them feel insecure. But anyway, he was in that last discussion, he says that a philosopher is one who practices death. And he says death is the separation of the body from the spirit, the body from the soul. And so the philosopher, in order to secure to meld his mind with what is unchanging in wisdom, he has to suspend the effect of the senses and the emotions and the allurements of the distortions of personal life from his mind, so that then his mind can seek unencumbered wisdom. So he says the philosopher's very role is a kind of abstraction, abstract contemplation, and therefore he's been practicing for death, and therefore a philosopher like himself doesn't need to fear death because he's been practicing it for his whole life. And so then this comes down through Christianity and everything, and we have inherited a kind of suspicion of the flesh, a suspicion of the body, a kind of animosity towards it that's worked in. And of course, in fairness to Plato, we also have his remarkable masterwork, The Republic. And in The Republic, he gives this portrait of the fully integrated human being, where all the aspects are working together and strengthened. And he gives, of course, the analogy of the city. The person is analogous to a city, and that's how he describes. The whole point of the Republic is to find what the principle of justice is, and he's analyzing the city only as an analogy. But even in that, there's a form of higher training that the highest part of us needs to go through, or the highest guardians in the state, a kind of higher training which does require the sort of abstraction that he talks about in the Phaedo. In the theosophical view, we speak about not merely we speak about evolution of form as we observe it, but evolution of form isn't just happening on its own. Evolution of form is not random mutations and the energies of life, but evolution represents the involution or the involvement of spirit in matter. So as spirit is involved in matter, as intelligence is incarnated into, and experience is incarnated into matter, and there is, from the theosophical standpoint, everything is alive. So everything is having experience at some level. Even what we call inorganic matter, even what we call stones and the elements, they are all alive. There's some kind of entity there that is gathering experience and therefore shaping matter and shaping form. So evolution of form represents involution of spirit. So the two are working together. Helena Blavatsky, who was the great mind of and founder of the modern theosophical movement, she says that the old mythologies it wasn't the fall of mortal man as we often interpret the mythology in the book of Genesis, but it's the fall of spirit into generation itself. And from the theosophical standpoint, that is a natural part of cyclic life. The universe the universe as we see it is just one expression of one periodic expression of the universe. From the theosophical standpoint, the divine ground, the ultimate Godhead, whatever it is, which is the absolute, which can't be known to us. We can't speculate upon it. We can't grant it qualities. Like all the great mystical traditions, they all say nothing can be said about it except that it is. And that it, the great breath, the great spirit, like a breath, it exhales periodically a universe and then it inhales it again. And so, and in that exhalation, in that embodied universal life, embodied galactic life, and embodied planetary life, there are distinct stages that are gone through, archetypal stages. And so life in a body represents this coming to terms with these stages, this great circle that we go through. And that can be looked at from the personal standpoint as well. There's an archetypal journey or travel in the personal sphere that's been known since ancient times. Shakespeare has in one of his plays, and Renee probably knows which play, the 7 stages of life, the 7 stages of man, where he talks about this archetypal classification, which I'm sure Shakespeare got from the classical world, from Greece and Rome. But we see that, don't we? We see that there is a birth. When we're first incarnated in life, the life of a baby is pure. It represents purity and innocence. And as the body begins to differentiate, well, gosh, even before that, you can think about the zygote in the mother's womb, this pure, perfect sphere that begins to differentiate into more cells and more cells, living in this state of unity, until at birth, which is also a kind of death, right? It is ejected from the mother's body, which seems to be some kind of rejection. And then it must come to terms with a whole new realm. And there, as the child grows and gathers experience, this innocence, this original innocence, is lost, and it needs to be lost. That is, it needs to be, the child will be shaped and carved and cut by experience, both developing bodily scars and mental and emotional scars, as well as strengths. And of course, the child will learn. They will go through puberty, go through a kind of a maximum sense of separation from maximum magnification of egotism, which can completely override any sense of ethical responsibility or sense of tradition. It's this is just part of life, that we go through this. Often the person then is attracted to a mate, and through that brings forth new life. There's a new sense of involvement in the community, a new sense of responsibility. That the person begins to no longer live selfishly, but begins to feel a part of the community. And of course, as we age and mellow, hopefully there's a distillation of wisdom. And there's a recovered innocence. There's an innocence that is more valuable at the end of life than the original innocence, because the original innocence is inherent, and the innocence that we may recover is earned through sifting, through experience, through suffering, through trial. And hopefully in our old age, if we're fortunate to live to old age, we have a kind of benevolence and blessing. We are at peace with life. We see the school of life, and we begin to understand how it works and the laws that are there. HPB is Helena Blavatsky, and she speaks about the equilibrium between spirit and matter in this quotation. In human nature, evil denotes only the polarity of matter and spirit, a struggle for life between the two manifested principles in space and time, which principles are one per se, inasmuch as they are rooted in the absolute. In cosmos, the equilibrium must be preserved. The operations of the two contraries produce harmony, like the centripetal and centrifugal forces, which are necessary to each other, mutually interdependent, in order that both shall live. If one is arrested, the action of the other will become immediately self-destructive. So she's giving this idea that cosmically, the principles of spirit and matter are in balance, just like they need to be in us. It reminds me of what Cliff said last week about the caduceus, that spirit and matter at every level of the caduceus and their crossings represent a kind of a balance or correlation at a certain level of mind and a certain level of matter. And from the theosophical standpoint, the spirit and matter are like two sides of a magnet. There's the positive and the negative. Spirit and matter are both just two sides of one and the same divine principle. But they seem, in our experience, they seem to be separated. And in Hindu thought, the illusion of their separation is necessary for there to be Maya. So we could not have experience, have the illusions we have, the educational illusions, I'll call them, with life in the body, unless there was this a seeming separation between the two, between subject and object, mind and matter, etc. And finally, let me just read these last two quotations, because they represent one thing that is very important in theosophical thought is the human incarnation is necessary to the overall evolutionary program. You know, we are often we come across, you know, materialistic evolutionary theories, which, you know, start with the assumption of matter. This is something Elizabeth talked about last week, that Western science starts with the assumption that matter is real, and then somehow mind is derived. But in evolution, we consider that man is, from a materialistic standpoint, he's sort of like a mutant ape. It's an ape that evolved kind of out of control and seemingly beyond his own abilities to control, and therefore we're soiling our nests and spoiling the planet. And sometimes it's become fashionable for ecologists to say, gosh, if only there weren't humans, the planet would be just fine. But from a theosophical standpoint, that's not true. Even though we're juveniles and we're making a lot of mistakes, the evolutionary program needs minds at our level incarnated, because we have an effect, a general effect on all of matter. And from the theosophical standpoint, the human being is sort of this Promethean edge of whose influence helps to quicken and elevate all of matter, because all of matter is on a journey towards what's called self-conscious godhood. All of matter is evolving and organizing, and the human being has to awaken to their duty to help matter do this. And this is beautifully, I'm going to go to this quote here while we stop. This is beautifully put by the Irish mystic George William Russell. And George William Russell was a friend of Yeats, part of the Irish literary Renaissance. And he was a theosophist. He was brought into theosophy by Yeats. And when he was a young man working at a drapery shop, and he was kind of living an ascetic life, and some remarkable writings came off of his pen. And this is from one of those articles where he kind of mythologizes, but he says so beautifully, kind of the cycle of life in the body as I see it. And he wrote, mythologically, Christ is incarnate in all humanity. Prometheus is bound forever within us. They are the same. They are a host. And the divine incarnation was not spoken of one, but of all those who, descending into the lower world, tried to change it into the divine image, and to wrest out of chaos a kingdom for the empire of light. So that's us. We are these spiritual beings who are called to this, to incarnate, to wrest out of chaos a kingdom for the empire of light. The angels, and he's speaking of us, speaking of our spiritual being, the angels saw below them in chaos a senseless rout, blind with elemental passion, forever warring with discordant cries, which broke in upon the world of divine beauty. And that the pain might depart, they grew rebellious in the Master's peace. And descending to earth, the angelic lights were crucified in men, leaving so radiant worlds, such a light of beauty for earth's gray twilight filled with tears. That through this elemental life might breathe the starry music brought from him. If the foreseer, and the reason that's in quotes, because that's a translation of the Greek Prometheus, one who sees ahead, if the foreseer be a true name for the Titan, the Christ, the being within us, it follows that in the host which he represents was a light which well foreknew all the dark paths of its journey, foreseeing the bitter struggle with a hostile nature, but foreseeing perhaps again a distant glory o'er the hills of sorrow, and that chaos, divine and transformed, with only gentle breathing, lit up by the Christ soul of the universe. There is a transforming power in the thought itself. We can no longer condemn the fallen, they who laid aside their thrones of ancient power, their spirit ecstasy and beauty on such a mission. Perhaps those who sank lowest did so to raise a greater burden. And of these, most fallen, it may in the hour of their resurrection be said, the last shall be first. So he ends on this wonderful expression, which you find elsewhere in his writings, that we should never judge a fallen brother, just as Plato has Socrates say, because we don't know, perhaps that being, that spiritual being, has fallen from a greater height and is simply experiencing more confusion, but has taken on a greater burden and therefore deserves our respect. Okay, well, that's all I think I have to say.
Thank you so much. Joe, you shared one of my favorite passages of all time in all writings with that quote from George William Russell. Yeah, it's always touched me to the core, and it does make so much sense to me of our journey here on Earth inside a human body, and what could be the purpose of such a thing, which sometimes seems so trying and filled with so much suffering. And why are we doing this? And that seems to be beautifully conveyed in the passage that you shared with us, and the talk that you gave leading up to that. So thank you ever so much.
I was thinking of this quote by Patanjali as you were speaking, where he says that the whole universe is for the education of the soul. And I was wondering if, in that sense, the body could be seen not in such a negative way that you were saying, but from so many different traditions, but the body can be seen as a school, that's our school that we have for our education. And then I remember, I think once you pointing out that the word education has to do with drawing out. And Socrates, that was what he was doing with all his dialogues, was drawing out. So in one sense, could it be that our challenge is, in relation to the one and the many, is to draw the one through the many? In other words, our bodies are a focal point for being able to tap the deepest elements of the universe.
Wow, that's beautiful. Yeah, and the word education, right? It's related to educing, educare, to draw out, and which is very different than having something impressed or imprinted or implanted from the outside. It assumes Plato's idea that true knowledge, the knowledge that really counts, is recollection, divine recollection, or drawing something from within. And I think also, in incarnated life, all the great traditions say that it involves suffering, and suffering is symbolized by friction, and the friction of the fire of friction. And don't we need, this is the thing, is if we're going to make peace with incarnated life, we have to come to grips with all its aspects, and including a thoughtful assessment of suffering and its purpose, and to have the humility to say, perhaps I need suffering. And I know in my own life, I look at different times where I've needed friction to awaken me, I've needed friction to motivate me, and so I think that making peace with that is important. And yes, as for the one and the many, that's very important. This is the danger the great traditions tell us of incarnated life, is that we lose touch with the one that is within us. Spiritual life is coming from that one, remembering that one which was with us, is with us in our beginning, outside of time, not a beginning that was some other time, but a beginning that's eternally now. But that one is with us. And if we lose vision of that, if we identify with the many, we fall prey to what is outside, that will fracture our sense of purpose and our sense of integrity. And then we get lost amongst the details. We become victims of mutation, movement, change. We find no fixed place to rest. as the Buddhists say, you know, we try to find permanence in impermanence, and that's impossible. So there has to be, I like that what you've said, Cliff, because it's like being a some kind of mediator between the two worlds, that we hold to the one, you know, in our hearts, that we hold to that wisdom and the sense of purpose and duty that gives us, but then we address the many. We address the many without falling into it, so to speak, without losing ourselves in the projection of our identity in the projected screen, the moving screen, you know, the Facebook of life. I have a nephew who was once at a party, and there was a cute girl he turned to and said, and apparently she didn't want to talk to him. You learn the hard way. But he said, he started asking her a little bit about her life. She began to answer, and then finally she just waved her mouth and said, you know, just look at my Facebook page, and turned around. So you know, that's the extreme of your don't talk to me. I'm not it. You want to find out who I am? Go to this image that's further derived than even I am. This derived image. That's where you'll find the true me. That's where I've really got it together, in that image. So we, you know, in various ways, whether we have social media accounts or not, we're guilty of the same thing. So I think that's part of it, is how do we manage the many? How do we move amongst the many in detachment, in beauty, in power, in vigor and virility, but at the same time not, as I frequently remind myself now as a business owner, that my experience of this or that job being incomplete does not mean I'm incomplete. That's always the temptation. I'm not allowed to rest or have a good night's sleep because that job is incomplete. No, there's a deep completion in me that's inherent as spirit that I can remind myself of. And just because that's incomplete, it doesn't mean I'm incomplete.
Thank you so much. And I do want to remind everyone that this really is a conversation circle. So we don't need to just ping pong back and forth between ourselves and Joe. So I'm glad to see Diana's hand up.
What is coming to me is, how do we keep in touch with the spirit? I mean, with all that's going on in the world and the suffering, for me, it's a practice. And it's really, I didn't want to be in the body for a long time. It took me a long time to really decide that the body was safe because of past lives and all the experiences that I've had. It wasn't a place that I felt like I was safe or I wanted to be. And I've done a lot of work to meditation and work to how do I be in the body, but not of the body. And I think it's a continual practice of keeping in touch with the one, you know, and really living from, for me, it's divine wisdom and divine timing, and really living from that place. But for me, it's having spiritual practices and ways that we can stay connected. And I really like the idea of that we're here to, you know, learn how to be in this body, and that's a gift. We're bringing oneness into the world, and love and compassion. And I think that if we start seeing the mission, and that's kind of a weird way to say it, but if we see our calling is to bring the spirit in the body and live from that place, we become an example for others of how they can live their life, and how and it's not easy. There's a lot of suffering and it doesn't make sense, but it's how do we keep in touch with faith and trust and in our core and live from that place when there's so much happening. And so that's what I loved what you said, and I thought it was very important. And along with last week, I just felt they fit really well together. And but I was really brought to, how do I remember my spiritual practice in the midst of being human and in this body? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's very eloquent. I think you've found the way. I mean, it sounds to me like you're finding your way into doing that, however you're daily replenished.
It's definitely a practice, a continual practice.
Yeah. Hi, Bob.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk on that same topic, because in Buddhism, they say there are 6 realms of existence, but it's only in the human realm that we can practice. And it's kind of interesting in that regard, because if you look at the 6 realms, you know, there are 2 realms: the hell realm, which is pure spirit without body, but in a very negative, pure anger, pure greed, pure aggressiveness. And then there's the hungry ghost, which doesn't have a body, but has all the remembrances of what it wants and the suffering of wanting more and not being able to assimilate it because it has no body. And then similarly at the top, we have divas and gods who are spiritual beings, but again, without the body, they, as was said, they lack the friction, they lack, the sort of movement forward. And then there's those two middle grounds, animals and men. And we are both animals and men. If we fall into the animal realm, then we sort of lose our own self-identity. Animals have consciousness, but probably not as much self-awareness as we may have. But within that human realm, that's where the practice happens. And we're sort of finding that motivation. And it struck me, one of the comments that you made was that community is important. And I think that may be the key in the human realm, is we're not just part of a herd, we're part of a sangha, we're part of, how much can we redefine the sense of we? And that's part of practice too, compassion, love. Yeah, so those 6 realms are interesting because in 5 of them we go nowhere. And everyone wants that human rebirth, which is very rare, but also we are all blessed with it. So a great opportunity.
Yeah. The community, yes, we could, because we think about, when we first hear the phrase life in the body, we probably think of our personal bodies, as we should. But we could think of corporate bodies, we could think of community bodies or nation bodies or village bodies, family bodies. What does that mean? And I think moral maturity involves integrating all of those as well. And just a quick reminder, comment in terms of the esoteric Buddhists, what you were talking about, the different realms, that the Theosophical teachers who tried to shine light on these traditions, they also said very similar things. That at death, when we let go of the physical body, we come to terms with the rupa that has been forged from kama, from the principle of desire, kama, and that rupa, that emotional body, has a kind of has a kind of cohesion to it. In a very wise person, it hardly exists at all; it just whisks away. But we get hung up by that for a period of time because that body has to decay, and it's of a much subtler matter, but it hangs us up in kama loka, which is a realm where we're kind of at the mercy of our illusions and our conflicts and things we didn't work out, and our desires, but in time that goes, and then there's a rest period between incarnations in Devahan, the land of the Devas, and that's also not a place where you can do any work. It's a necessary period for rest and recuperation, and it's said that in that realm, the human mind, or whatever is rudimentary mind at that level, not a personal mind, but it replays an idealized version. It dreams of an idealized version of the incarnation that's just happened in those terms, and it especially extends frustrated good desires that we had that were blocked for some reason. So it plays out, elaborates our feelings of altruism, our feelings of beauty, perhaps our kinship with the arts, whatever might have helped us develop this better nature. It plays out in a certain way, and until that dream eventually fades, and then we take the next incarnation. But so the Theosophists also say it's only in embodied existence that we can really do the work.
It's interesting because in the Book of the Dead, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, that's what you're preparing for, is that place where then you can use those positive trainings or practices to invoke, compassion or something that will push you forward, as opposed to the fear, which is the main difficulty. Out of fear, you grab the first incarnation you could find, and bang, there you are, a frog.
Yes. Yeah.
Other thoughts about life in the body, personal experiences of life in the body, maybe where there's been a juxtaposition of something so physical happening to us that we have more of a sense of spirit as a reality. Cliff mentioned one in the last week or two about experiencing a fall rock climbing and not knowing whether he was going to survive it or not, and having this experience of his spirit just leaving the body and watching it go down. But a very clear experience that he was not that body that was going through space. So it's interesting how life in the body can somehow make very vivid to us what is more real than this thing that we're inhabiting right now.
The last week, Elizabeth read us a line from one of her friends. I forget who her friend was. You might remember. It was this great line. Our job is to ground cosmic love all the way down to our toes. To ground cosmic love all the way down to our toes. Do any of you come from a tradition? You know, I remember there was a few years ago, Time magazine had an article on the concept of heaven, and I remember there was a preacher who was interviewed, and from an evangelical tradition, and he said, oh, for a long time it's been people have been embarrassed to say that all they want is heaven. He goes, but I proudly say that. That's what I want. I'm ready to get out of this earth as quickly as possible and go to heaven. And I thought it was kind of interesting that people have an ambiguity about it, an escapist view, And being raised Catholic myself, there was a lot of discussion about, what is the point of earth? I mean, if you can, die as an infant and go straight to heaven, if that's what it's all about, then what's the point of being here? So I really welcomed philosophies that, like Theosophy and what it pointed to, that spoke about a kind of heroism and about this incredible value that comes from being in a body, that it's absolutely essential. And also points out that it's a, and I think it is a vice to take the side of spiritual escapism. I think truth demands that we come to terms with this life and with its value, and trust that there's a greater wisdom behind us being here. Bob was talking last week about karma, and about there was a phrase he said that karma, that if you take the assumption that there is justice, that it's universe of law and there's justice, then you can own I believe that's the word you use. You can own your life in a certain way. You can own responsibilities, so you're not always playing the victim. For me, it's been immensely therapeutic to think in this direction, and it's helped me resolve, difficulties about all that escapism theology that I grew up with.
There's an interesting perspective, not so much of heaven, but in Buddhism, we talk about the Pure Land. And in that form of Buddhism, the Pure Land is where you let go of my power to be enlightened, my desire, myself, and you sort of surrender to other power, to Amida Buddha, which is the Buddha of the Pure Land. And so you sort of put yourself in the hand of the other side, the cosmic side, which will draw you there without this effort. So it's kind of a beautiful image of letting go, to practice without all this egoism and dualism of self-power, but then focus on what's called in Pure Land Buddhism, other power.
Yeah. I think, and you can find that same teaching of transcending self-agency, I might call it, a sense of self-agency, self-assertion, in esoteric Christianity as well. Paul's statement, not I, but Christ in me, or or Jesus is thy will be done. I think all of that points to an experience that you are offering your incarnation, offering your power, your relationships, your circumstances, your talents. You're offering them to the greater will, and you can experience this will working through you. That you feel supported, that you're part of a much larger purpose. It's not personal willfulness, but you're riding a wave, so to speak, and you're consecrating or dedicating your incarnation to that will.
I wanted to see if I could call upon Alice, who is experiencing one of those life in the body things of being sick. And she's still with us. I so appreciate that. And she has made a very long study of the life and practices of Moshe Feldenkrais. And he had lots of things to say about life in the body, I think. And I wonder how you think he might weigh in here, or what thoughts you have, Alice, from your own perspective on that.
Yeah, thank you, Renee. At the risk of having a major coughing fit, see if I can share. What was coming to me is, through my Feldenkrais practice, this idea of turning towards suffering rather than the reactive escaping. And in Feldenkrais lessons, we have the opportunity to slow things down and start to notice our compulsive sort of avoidance of suffering or turning away from the matters at hand. And I had a semi-miraculous experience, wrote about it, I don't know, a year and a half ago, where I was driving on the freeway. I live in Portland, Oregon. I was driving over the Fremont Bridge, this huge freeway bridge, and I was driving behind a guy in a pickup truck, and he had 2 dogs in the back who were barking frantically and running around. And I was terrified that they were going to jump out. And I've always had a real sensitivity to the suffering of animals. And there was a moment, this weird experience of like time opening up. And in a split second, I could see like every fiber of my being wanting to turn away and not attend. But because I could feel that happening, I actually chose in the moment to sort of stay with. It was like I heard a voice saying, no, look. And in that moment, a flood of compassion opened in me that the fear wasn't gone, and the anxiety wasn't gone, but it was like it was all there together. And when you said that beautiful quote of the cosmic love down to our toes, that's what it felt like. So this idea of suffering and friction, and the body being such a wonderful place to experience this in. And what felt, I think, the tremendous contribution of Feldenkrais was understanding the body as a doorway into this complete experience as a human being, and our ability to sense ourselves and see our habits and patterns of trying to escape and avoid or push down suffering, difficulty, that actually can crack us open to love and compassion. And I also thought of, apparently Tibetan monks and nuns pray for enough suffering to open within them, the greatest possible compassion and love. So
Alice, does Feldenkrais emphasize, is it a kind of a body work that looks for the way these defenses or blocks are in the body, and they're freed up or loosened up? Is that kind of what's behind it?
Yeah, and he speaks of these neuromuscular patterns, habits and patterns, and developed movement lessons that you do as a group, but there's also a hands-on sort of body work side. They both have the same intention, but it's a different experience. And yeah, to become more aware of our habits and patterns in movement that, of course, are related to our habits and patterns of thinking and feeling and all of that together. He was a strong proponent of how body mind are one, not, of course, separated.
I'm reminded that the verb form of ignorance is ignore, is to ignore. And our defenses are ways in which we ignore putting our attention on various things. And then there's, fear gathers around that, and then we end up projecting that onto others and creates all kinds of shadows. So the path of truth is difficult.
It is.
But it requires confronting all of that, all of those defenses. Yeah.
And he spoke a lot to how conditioned we are by, the sit up straight, stand up straight, no pain, no gain, kind of this mentality that distances us that much more from our experience in ourselves and strengthens that tendency to ignore or tamp down or, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks.
Tony, what do you think about all this stuff? Is there any life experience that you're reminded of by some of these conversations about life in the body?
Yeah, so I think what is really striking me hearing this theosophical perspective of the journey of life is how there's the biological perspective, right? Spiritual and material, theosophical, biological, and how important it is to really look at both of those perspectives when you're trying to when I'm trying to understand, this life experience, because they both play such a big role in different ways. But the idea of the body being a teacher and an educator when it comes to suffering is, I think, what really hit me most, because the longer the resistance happens to the suffering, the stronger the suffering gets, until it becomes to a point where you're either forced to learn the lesson in an uncomfortable way, or you opt out. And I mean, we see this happening all the time now, right? And the suffering, this disconnection between being in the body and not in the body, and the multitude of distractions that we have, social media was brought up, drugs and alcohol, whatever, that we can get our hands on, to not have to have this feeling teaching that we get from the body. It's such an education place. And I really do, that really resonated with me. I'm learning this more every day, how to feel things. And the body is what teaches that. I can think my way out of anything, but if I can't understand how I'm feeling, I have to be present in order to do that. So I'm just really appreciating this perspective. I've heard many of these concepts in many different places, and to have them all come together like this in one solid place is great. So thank you.
Oh my gosh. I usually ask for a vote of thanks for our speaker. I almost feel as if you just gave that, Tony.
Well, I appreciate it.
Joe, is there any last point that you'd like to make to us?
Just a couple lines from Whitman, if I may.
Yeah.
Was somebody asking to see the soul? See your own shape and countenance, persons, substances, beasts, the trees, the running rivers, the rocks and sands. All hold spiritual joys, and afterwards loosen them. How can the real body ever die and be buried? Of your real body, and any man's or woman's real body, item for item, it will elude the hands of the corpse cleaners and pass to fitting spheres, carrying what has accrued to it from the moment of birth to the moment of death. Behold, the body includes and is the meaning, the main concern, and includes and is the soul. Whoever you are, how superb and how divine is your body, or any part of it.
Thank you so much. That was just marvelous, Joe. And I'm so glad that all of you were able to join us and lend us your ears, your thoughts, your perspectives, your attention. And we'll look forward to seeing you again at Gems from the Wisdom Traditions. Thank you all. And thank you, Joe Miller, so very much for your help from the Theosophical Tradition.